Now, ESG is an abbreviation I don't really have to introduce. It stands for environmental, social and governance criteria, and is a concept for sustainable investment. Now we talk of two of these, the E and the G, but we start off with climate change. Now, the Paris Agreement 2015 was clearly a landmark decision, and it's the first time all nations together, except the US, come together to combat climate change. The aim is to strengthen the global response and to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. One aspect of this is to make finance flows consistent with lower greenhouse gas emissions, and we will discuss this later on the panel. But first, we have a keynote speaker, Professor Thomas Stocker from the University of Bern, who will give us the full picture of the climate crisis. Let me briefly introduce Mr. Stocker. He has been head of the Department of Climate and Environmental Physics of the Institute of Physics at the University of Bern since 1993. He has authored and co-authored more than 200 scientific articles on climate change, and he has received numerous awards and honorary doctorate degrees. Thomas Stocker was also a co-chair of the Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And the IPCC is an international body under the auspices of the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme. And they provide policymakers with assessments of the scientific basis of climate change, its impact, but also with options to mitigations. So Thomas Stocker was also the official nominee by the Swiss government for the chair of the IPCC, and I couldn't think of anyone better to give us an insight into the climate change debate as it stands today. Thank you very much. Please welcome Mr. Stocker. That's it.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an unusual audience for me, but for many years I've been very much aware of the importance of your profession, also personally, of course. And therefore, it's really important that all sectors and segments of society know the facts about climate change and know the challenges that lie ahead of us with this problem that is, as of today, still unsolved. The climate crisis, is there a way out? The answer will be yes. And now I could sit down again, but I really want to take the opportunity to give you a few facts. Why I believe that there is indeed a way out, but it's not automatic, and we need a lot of effort to do that. This photograph has changed humankind's vision of where we live. You see in a relatively short distance from one another a habitable world, our planet, in this picture of Earthrise, and below you see the surface of the moon, an uninhabitable location in space. So within very short distance, we see these two worlds, and it's clear that there are processes on the Earth that allow us to survive. It's the greenhouse gases, it's the water. But these greenhouse gases are changing, and they are the origin of the problem of climate change. I want to address 4 points in the next few minutes. We know the present. We can measure it. Natural science will inform us objectively about what is happening. With the same instruments, we can estimate the future. And the realization of these changes that lie ahead of us bring us to the conclusion that resources will also change, and these resources are in danger. Based on these insights, we look at the opportunities that arise to really confront these changes and to mitigate climate change. The most important figure and diagram in our science is this one. Since 1958, scientists are measuring in great precision the concentration of carbon dioxide which is a molecule in the atmosphere that is a greenhouse gas. It's the second most important greenhouse gas after water vapor, has increased incessantly since that time. You see the precision of these measurements by the annual cycle of carbon dioxide. A very interesting and impressive signal of the terrestrial biosphere in the Northern Hemisphere, the breathing of vegetation. But overprinted on this breathing of the vegetation is this incessant increase. And of course, you could ask the question, well, that may be just chance. Perhaps if we go back 200 years from now, we would have experienced similarly high carbon dioxide concentrations. So who tells me that this is an anomaly that we have to take care of? Well, the science has addressed this question and put that discussion to rest. Among other institutes, our institute at the University of Bern goes regularly to very cold places, to Greenland and Antarctica, brings back ice cores. You see an ice core here, freshly cut from Antarctica. And in these ice cores, there is air enclosed, old air. In fact, if you go to Antarctica and look up the oldest air, you find that this air is 800,000 years old. And so if we manage to measure the concentrations of the greenhouse gases in these little bubbles enclosed in the ice, then we can address that question of whether what we see today is unprecedented. And indeed it is, as you see on this diagram. This is a time series of natural carbon dioxide variations over the last 800,000 years. Time starts on the left with 800,000 years before present, natural variations which go in synchrony with the ice age cycles. And at the very far right, you see the concentrations that we measure today. In 2018, over 410 units of this concentration, whereas the natural range was between 180 and 280. In other words, today we have concentrations that are by 30%, 35% higher than ever in the past 800,000 years. There are other observations, millions of thermometer observations around the entire world allow us to reconstruct the temperature history in the Northern Hemisphere in the red curve and the Southern Hemisphere in the blue curve since 1880. And you see there is indeed natural variability in the climate system in which you have a warmer year or a colder year, but if you take on the long-term perspective, you see that also these curves point upward. There is a global mean warming that we have measured by about 1 degree Celsius since the beginning of the 20th century. And it's quite impressive to see how record years become more and more frequent as you go along this curve. 2014 in the Northern Hemisphere, the warmest year since 1880. 2015 again, 2016 another record-breaking year. 2017 here, a year with a little bit lower temperature because the natural variability of El Niño southern oscillation in the tropical Pacific has changed the sign, and that has an imprint on the global mean temperature. But you see, we're on an upward trajectory with the temperature caused by the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, itself caused by the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. Now, along with temperature, other important parameters also change. You see here in the curve, since the beginning of the 20th century, the increase in sea level, 19 centimeter altogether in the 20th century. This is an amount to which you have to adapt to if you live in coastal regions. The reason for this increase is not only the thermal expansion of the warming ocean, but also the discharge of ice from the large ice sheets. I just want to give you one example of the discharge from the Greenland ice sheet that has been very well observed thanks to the new satellite missions that observe the ice sheet in unprecedented precision. In this color graph, you see the northern part of the ice sheet of Greenland. The colors indicating the speed of the ice at the surface. So science is able to actually measure how the ice flows on the Greenland ice sheet. And you see here blue colors around the fringes of the Greenland ice sheet where this speed is high. And the purple colors indicate very fast flowing ice streams that discharge ice into the ocean where it melts and where it contributes to the rise of sea level. In particular, there are very rapid outlet ice streams here. I've indicated some of them. In the lower left corner, you see Jakobshavn isbre that speeds the ice into the ocean at a rate of 13 kilometers per year. Now, that's how it looks like if you inspect that terminus of the ice stream. You see at the upper part of the picture the ice sheet in the distance, and the line that is more or less the curve in the middle of the photograph is the terminus of this ice stream's Jakobshavn that comes forward at a speed of about 13 kilometers per year, and the icebergs there then float on the fjord. A very easy number to remember is that Greenland loses about 1 cubic kilometer of ice every day. This contributes about 0.8 millimeters of sea level globally. So what's happening here impacts everybody on this planet. That is why the United Nations has commissioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to provide scientific information for the policymakers about the challenge of a changing climate. In 1990, in preparation of the Earth Summit in Rio, the first assessment report has been published, and since then we have gone through 5 cycles. The last cycle products are depicted here with comprehensive reports overall over 7,500 printed pages. If you want to inform yourself about the scientific status of knowledge, please read those pages. But of course, only specialists would read parts of that report, and that's why it's so important to actually write summaries for policymakers. These summaries for policymakers are negotiated documents according to the UN regulations, and in these documents, every word has to be approved by all governments of the world in consensus. So this is an example of a statement out of our summary for policymakers of the Working Group 1 that I co-chaired with a Chinese colleague. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal. A very short sentence based on millions of facts, of observations, some of which I have shown to you, a statement that was acceptable to all governments of the world. Another one, which is even more important, is this one here. Human influence on the climate system is clear. So all the governments, again, in consensus, have accepted that. Many of my colleagues have taken a bet that I will lose that sentence because of an intervention by one country, for example, Saudi Arabia or the United States. Well, that sentence has been in there because the scientific evidence is simply overwhelming. Let's now go to the future and estimate how that future is going to be. And as you all know, I don't need to tell you that the future is always estimated in the context of scenarios. We don't really know the future, but we imagine scenarios, and under specific scenarios, the future would then look like this or like that. That's the same in climate science. You see here the global mean temperature change relative to the end of the 20th century, simulated by climate models run by 25 centers around the world. Again, this is not just a freak center somewhere in one country who is an activist or whatever. It is consolidated science. And you see a red scenario, which is the so-called business as usual scenario, where the emissions of greenhouse gases continues unabated, and a blue scenario that is consistent with the path of Paris, that is a limitation of the warming in the first half of the 21st century. You can read off on the axis how much warming each of these scenarios will produce. And you see, for the business as usual scenario, it's about 4 degrees by the end of the 21st century. Add to that the 1 degree that we have already observed since pre-industrial. So we're at about 5 degrees. 5 degrees is a lot of warming. It's about the warming that we have experienced since the last ice age to pre-industrial. And you know, the face of the Earth has completely changed during such a change. The blue scenario, on the other hand, shows a warming of about 1 degree. Add to that the other 1 degree that we have experienced already, so that's about a scenario that is roughly compatible and consistent with the Paris Agreement. Now, with this warming, we have stated and affirmed that further warming will increase the likelihood of severe and pervasive and irreversible impacts. Now, this is quite a bold statement, and it's a statement that is also residing in the summary for policymakers, so a very robust statement that has found the consensus of the governments. Now, nobody is living in a global mean temperature, and therefore we need to ask the question, how does that play out in different regions of the world? Well, over the ocean, because the ocean absorbs a lot of heat, the warming is actually decreased. The warming is weaker, and you see this indicated by these orange and yellow colors. Conversely, on the continents, we experience even higher warming than the global mean, in particular in the interior of the continents, here for this business as usual scenario, by the end of the 21st century, somewhere between 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. If you go up to the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, the Arctic, you see changes that range between 7 and 11 degrees. This is a huge change for a large area of our planet, and a change that will change fundamentally the aspect and the ecosystems in that area. Now, in Switzerland, we are not saved of climate change. In fact, we get more of the climate change in Switzerland. In the global mean, we've observed 1 degree. In Switzerland, in the same time, 1.8 degrees Celsius. So almost double the warming we have already experienced in Switzerland relative to the global mean. This means that ice bodies in Switzerland, the glaciers, will retreat. As you can see here, this estimate of the extent of the Great Aletsch Glacier, 2000, that's the extent we are used to, 2030, a little bit shorter. Already now we can measure the retraction of the terminus of the Great Aletsch Glacier very significantly, 2060, 2090. Essentially no ice left along the main path of the Great Aletsch Glacier, and only the tributary glaciers above 3,000 meters above sea level remain and survive under the global warming scenario. So let's now consider what that actually means. So far, I've talked only in physical figures. Degrees Celsius, millimeters per year. These are, to many people, abstract quantities. But we need to consider that these changes impact us not only globally, but also regionally. And when these impacts strike home, they affect the resources. I want to highlight 3 fundamental resources for our society and our human well-being. The first resource is health. I don't need to explain that. We're paying high premiums already today in the industrialized world to secure our health and to heal us in case our health fails. So the resource health is indisputably an important one for humankind, and that resource is in danger due to the increase of temperature. Here I just show you a picture of forest fires. They are abundant, they have become more frequent as a response to the more frequent heat waves that we have occurring in several regions of the world. But I want to look at a different aspect of the resource health, and that is this one. If it's very hot and at the same time very humid, these are conditions where we all don't feel very well. These are conditions that are a threat to bodies that are elderly, that are frail, so the vulnerability here plays an important role. Now, the physiologists have means to estimate the risk of the combination of temperature and humidity, and they can actually calculate the number of days per year where we have a risk to trespass the deadly threshold. It's the so-called wet bulb temperature. That's a very technical quantity. I don't want to go in there, but the point is that we can calculate the areas based on climate model simulations and observations where today this risk is high, and we can calculate the number of those days. You see here a few patches of yellow, which means that there will be about 50 to 80 days per year where you shouldn't stay outside for many hours, and you certainly shouldn't carry out hard labor. You see India, for example, or Northern Australia, where during about 50 to 80 days, the conditions are such that they may actually be risky for your health and well-being. We now go to the end of the 21st century in a business-as-usual scenario, and you see how this area and intensity or number of days increase. So essentially in the entire equatorial area, we have increased risk of deadly heat at the number that is significant portion of the year, 300 to 350 days per year in Central and West Africa, in India, in Indonesia, Northern Australia for business as usual. With this one, today we can cope. This one is a very different story. The resource health is immediately affected by that. Now compare this risk with the risk and the distribution of the risk if we manage to keep the global mean warming below 2 degrees Celsius. That's in the next diagram here. There are areas where it's still rather unhealthy at the end of the 21st century, but the areas are much reduced. And as you can see, for example, in India, we are at around 100 days. I go back so that you can compare essentially the price we will pay in terms of the resource health if we do not manage to limit climate change at 2 degrees Celsius. That's the price we pay. This one is what we get when we manage to limit the warming below 2 degrees. The second resource, not less important, is the resource water. Water for our use, but also for the use of the ecosystem that delivers services to us. For example, the production of food. As you can see here in this picture, a Chinese farmer who tries to break the ground after a long period of drought to perhaps help the plants here to grow. Water and the distribution of water will certainly change with the warming that is anticipated in the 21st century. As you can see here in this map, a map, incidentally, that was also part of that summary for policymakers, a map that shows the business as usual case by the end of the 21st century. There are areas where we will get more rainfall. These areas are blue, in particular in the tropics and the high latitudes in both hemispheres. But there are also areas where you see brown color. That brown color indicates a reduction of precipitation by 20 to 30% by the end of the 21st century. One area in particular you recognize, the Mediterranean, North Africa, where today we are already faced with drought and shortage of water, situation that governments and populations have adapted to, but situations that exacerbate under business as usual. So the resource water also changes, and that constitutes specific and regionally different challenges to the entire world. And the third resource that I want to highlight is the resource of land. Again, a resource that I don't need to explain in detail. The highest price that you pay for an item during your lifetime is probably buying land, certainly in Switzerland. Now, sea level rise will undeniably reduce the availability of land, will threaten coastal communities. Hundreds of millions of people will face sea level rise and will have to adapt to that. We can quantify that, as you see in this diagram that starts in the year 1700. That's when, from then on, we have dependable measurements on sea level and sea level rise. You see that sea level has changed a little bit over the 20th century, 19 centimeter, measured by different techniques. The last 20 years also satellite measurements, so these are very, very robust quantities that we have. And then again on the right side, at the end of that diagram, the 21st century development of sea level increasing in both scenarios. The blue scenario at about 40 to 50 centimeters, the red scenario again 70 centimeters. This is the adaptation task that you have under business as usual for coastal communities. Some highly developed countries such as the Netherlands will be able to adapt to that. They've already calculated in sea level rise of about 2.5 meters, but other coastal and low-lying countries in particular in the United States, but also in India, the Pacific Islands, they will have great troubles. Their land will disappear, their home and habitat will be lost, and you can imagine what that means when the resources actually go away. So, in summary here, 3 resources: health, water, and land, all threatened by climate change, and therefore, I submit to you, the change of climate is not only a challenge that is expressed in degrees Celsius and meters per year, it is a resource problem. Climate change is a resource problem, and therefore, we need to really focus on that. Well, I'm just quoting the second president of the United States of America. In the 18th century, these presidents still had some amount of wisdom. John Adams said, "Every problem is an opportunity in disguise," and I submit to you that this is also the case for climate change. And I want to now look at that in the last part here very quickly. It started with the historical agreement of Paris that says we need to hold the warming well below 2 degrees, a consensus of 195 countries, a historical achievement here after many, many years of negotiations, too many years, I would say. The second point is that efforts need to be made to stay below even a more stringent level, 1.5 degrees Celsius, and therefore CO2 emissions need to fall to 0 by 2050. That is a consequence of the scientific insight that we have provided in the 5 assessment cycles of the IPCC. That is not contested. It is CO2, and these emissions have to fall if you want to satisfy these first 2 statements. So what do we have to do? We need a 4th industrial revolution. Now, I'm very much aware of that number 4. For many of you, the 4th industrial revolution is the Internet of Things. But I would argue that the Internet of Things is nothing more than an extension of digitalization, and that is the 3rd industrial revolution. We actually need the 4th one. The first one, mechanization. The second one, electrification. The third one, we are still in, and we are coping and benefiting from that industrial revolution. That's digitalization. The 4th one will look like this: decarbonization, replacing all sources of fossil fuel emissions by technology that we can gain energy through, for example, wind, photovoltaics, photothermal, geothermal, hydrodynamics. This 4th industrial revolution is the decarbonization. And without decarbonization, we will not manage to mitigate climate change, to limit the warming below 2 degrees Celsius, and therefore we will have business as usual. So let's look what an industrial revolution actually means. It's a message of hope. It's a message of opportunity. We will develop smarter products. We will develop new jobs and markets, better life quality, and new values and lifestyles. And it's not a secret that the unabated cycle of consumerism has to change. It's clear. We have to have qualitative growth and no longer quantitative growth. Why is that? Because the 4th industrial revolution will be the first one in human history that has to evolve under specific constraints. And these intrinsic constraints are deeply connected to the resources that we have talked about before. We will have limited material resources. That's quite obvious by now. We will have limited ecosystem resources, and we have limited land resources. And it's within this context that we have to become creative and humble to evolve in this 4th industrial revolution. But as all these other industrial revolutions that have happened, also this 4th one is an opportunity. It's probably the biggest opportunity of the 21st century. And with that, I'd like to close. Please remember, climate change mitigation is not a nuisance. It's a necessity. It's a social, ecological, and economic imperative. Climate change mitigation is ultimately resource stewardship. Thank you very much.
Das Panel? Du mit dich? Nein, mit dem nachher. The little misunderstanding was about questions. We will have Professor Stocker here for questions right after the panel. Now, when I look at the temperature charts Mr. Stocker has shown, if it were a financial chart, I'd probably say this financial asset is in a bubble. But unfortunately, it isn't. And it's not that easy to make the price change or the temperature change. And of course, there's no denying that the climate change is basically made by humans. And I'm really glad you fought for that sentence to stay in the IPCC reports. So the question really is, as asset managers, what can we do? Or as investors, we can put it more broadly. Asset owners have started to think about how climate change will affect their portfolios in the long run. And this is what I would like to discuss with 3 panelists. Can you please come to the stage? Können Sie? Da? Zit mit die? Let me briefly introduce the panelists we have here. So first we have René Weber. He represents the official Switzerland. He heads the Policy Coordination Division of the Swiss State Secretariat for International Finance. He's responsible for financial markets policy and strategy, and he leads the dialogues and negotiations with partner countries of Switzerland in this regard. And he spent a decade at the International Monetary Fund, partly as a member of the executive board. Now in the middle we have Guido Führer. He has been responsible for the Swiss Re Group Asset Management since his appointment to Group Chief Investment Officer in 2012. He, as such, is a member of the Executive Committee and he oversees a total investment of $130 billion. He was a driving force of Swiss Re implementing ESG benchmarks to the whole of their portfolios. And we have Frederik Hochfeld. And I'd like to thank Frederik for stepping in on a short notice because someone else from Amundi was actually planned to come. Frederik is head of investment specialists, index and smart beta at Amundi since 2015. And he has been with the firm for 7 years. Those who don't know Amundi, shame on you, it's the biggest asset manager in Europe. So thanks very much for being here. Let me start off with individual questions to all the panelists, and I'd like to start off with Guido Führer. Swiss Re has been the first insurance company worldwide, or reinsurance in this case, to move to ESG benchmarks. Why did you do that, and when are your portfolios finally fully decarbonized?
Thank you much for the question. As you mentioned, I think we are still the only one insurance or the reinsurance company which has switched 100% to ESG, and you introduced the abbreviation at the beginning of the day. That's why climate is part of environment. Now, not a surprise, as the biggest reinsurance company, you are exposed to any climate change, again, be it on natural catastrophe or many other line of business. That's why you have a natural interest to be on top of development in order to price the risk correctly. Insurance basically means you pool risk and you give a price tag to it. And it's very clear, such changes, and again, listening to Professor Stocker, I think you're not only touched as a human being, but you're clearly also touched as a company which is directly linked to those development. Now, our question was how we can make a difference on the asset side. Of course, we could argue it's for doing good, and basically showing a lot of corporate citizenship. On the other hand, we are a listed company, public listed. That means on a quarterly basis, we release result. And if the result on the asset management side are below expectation, we feel it and basically put the strategy at risk. That's why our challenge was to translate the factor ESG, and again, climate risk is a big one, into a context which is supported from a shareholder's point of view. And we made the sentence last year, probably not as earth-shattering as some of the statements which Professor Stocker has made, but we made the statement, ESG makes economic sense. Now, we don't take that too lightly. I think we have done a lot of research ourselves. Of course, we leveraged all the academics to see how a portfolio reacts if you start to look at it from a different risk factor. That's why if you look climate risk, social and governance as well as a risk factor, then suddenly you start to quantifying it. And then, of course, you need to see what is the dynamic in the portfolio. And we looked at all those components. The most obvious one, the most obvious question which we receive, how much you return to suffer.
Can we come to that question later?
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for bringing it up. We will discuss this question. I want to really know, when is your portfolio fully decarbonized?
Probably the most diplomatic answer is it depends. Now, it depends on the portfolio manager. On Swiss Re, we have done very dramatic step, and the most dramatic was 2015. We started to sell kind of coal-intensive type, or thermal coal-intensive type of holding. And we defined the benchmark, 30%. If of the revenue, more 30% comes from thermal coal, be it on the mining side or the energy production, we sold it. And again, this was above 1 billion, which is all. But that's for me, let's say, the short-term reaction. And maybe you have to do it if nothing else helps. The much more sustainable way is give the person on the ground, which makes everyday decision which security is better, the right incentive framework. And In our world, as I don't have to tell you, it's all professional, it's all about benchmark and benchmark construction. The biggest impact on us is what type of benchmark we apply. And that's why we looked, what does it mean if you switch to an ESG benchmark? What are the dynamics? And that's why now I can argue, I have given all incentive, and this is a much more sustainable way than selling. I've given all incentive to all sectors to think about environment, social and governance.
But you wouldn't say a precise year?
And that's why the incentive is given via lower funding rate. Companies can fund lower. That means they have all incentive to improve the rating. Now it's a portfolio manager who makes the decision. We defined minimal threshold, and to use a technical term, we have taken MSCI. Has to be at least a BB in our benchmark. Now, it doesn't completely exclude, let's say, lower performing company from an ESG point of view, but it makes it much more difficult to make a difference and to beat an ESG benchmark.
Yeah. But still, when is your portfolio fully decarbonized? Can you say that?
I will not make a specific statement. I'll give you one figure. When we started 2015, the so-called coal intensity of our portfolio, on the credit side, it decreased by 30%. On the equity side, it decreased by 70% within the last 3 years. Gives you a feeling about the journey. Now, when are we fully decarbonized? I think that's probably a hard say.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's the big bulk is already captured, and we continue to capture it.
Good, thank you. Now, Mr. René Weber, have politicians grasped the urgency? I mean, they certainly have the figures and the IPCC reports to do something.
Well, you see, I'm representing the government, so the government is part of this UN community that was Mr. Stocker talked about. So there's a clear commitment by all authorities in Switzerland to actually recognize and also have the same aim to achieve the goals that have been agreed. And we have ratified, Parliament has ratified that agreement. So that means politicians in a broader sense have agreed, and we should really strive to get there. I'm from the Finance Ministry, so we've teamed up with the Federal Office of the Environment, who is more on the kind of technical side. We're looking into the financing side, the resource question when it comes to finance. Climate change is a resource problem. Maybe finance as a resource can help resolve that problem.
Are you working with the financial industry to put your case forward?
Yes, we already in 2016 we have included sustainability in a broad sense into our financial market strategy. Together with digitalization, the third revolution, the fourth one is already in our report in 2016. We have regularly organized roundtables where we try to get the view of the financial industry. Frederick told me in the morning, well, you have it easy. You're from the government, you can just tell the audience what to do. I would actually turn that around and say, look, you should be telling me what you need. What are the framework conditions that the financial industry needs so that this new era, this opportunity can be seized also for all financial market players.
And we will speak about some of that later on. Now, Frederik Hochfeld, what are the drivers for the demand of low carbon investments? You as an asset manager or representative of an asset manager, you feel the demand from the investors out there. What is the demand, and will it stay on even if sort of the environment is really bad and the economic climate is changing?
Yeah, thank you. So as a matter of fact, we do see a lot of demand, and so just a few words on who I am and where I come from and why I see this demand. So I work for Amundi. I work more specifically on the index platform at Amundi, and we do a lot of sustainable, low carbon index strategies. And from that perspective, we are part of the broad, let's say, sustainable offering that we have at Amundi, which is quite large. We do see over the past 4 years, we have seen over the past 4 years a very significant increase in clients' demand regarding decarbonization strategies, not only for index solutions, but also more broadly for any kind of stock picking solution, investment solutions. And I believe what has been driving this increase in demand, there are multiple reasons for that. First, there have been some changes in regulations, and we do expect some changes in regulations to come again. For example, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the law on energy transition that was passed in France more than 2 years ago now, which makes it mandatory for institutional investors as a whole, not necessarily to decarbonize their portfolio, but at the very least to explain how they believe their portfolio is aligned with the 2-degree scenario that was aligned, that was agreed upon at the COP 21. So there is.
So they have to report whether they are on the 2-degree.
Yeah, they have to report how they believe their portfolio is aligned with the 2-degree scenario. Yeah. So there is not a very strict framework on how companies, how asset owners should do that, because the regulators want to be open. It's a learning curve for the asset owners as well as for the regulator. So the idea is really a comply or explain approach, which at least makes it explicit for asset owners that it is part of their duty to understand their exposure to the broad climate risk in general. So this is something that we have seen in France and that we expect to see in other countries. I believe the UK Minister for Pension Funds has decided to open a dialogue with pension funds in the UK in order to implement in the medium term, I would say, similar regulation. Another driver of the demand for low carbon strategy, I believe, is the investment case. There is an investment case to be made. If you believe that the so-called carbon risk is mispriced, and this is probably one of the biggest market failure we have seen, the fact that the negative externalities from carbon emissions are not priced, because if they were priced, the price for carbon should be much higher, and carbon-intensive companies should have a much lower price. So there is a clear investment case from that perspective, and we've seen a number of investors that have taken the opportunity to decarbonize their portfolio, not only because they want to do good for society, but also because they clearly see a financial opportunity, or at least a very strong risk management case. Again, the idea is that you want to reduce your exposure to this mispriced carbon risk. Another reason, because there are plenty of reasons why we have seen a growing demand for low carbon solution, I believe it comes from the fact that today we are able to better understand the carbon footprint of companies. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, carbon data, both the quality, the quantity, the coverage, and the scope of the carbon data that we had was relatively poor. There were already a number of carbon data providers, but most of the carbon data were, I would say, rough estimates based on econometric model, so-called input-output econometric model. As of today, what we've seen over the past few years, we have seen a growing offering coming from different ESG data providers of carbon data, and we are really better able to understand what is the carbon footprint of a company, and we are therefore able to make better investment decisions, again, better investment decisions that we were able to make just 10 years from now.
If I may just call you on this. The speech we heard was very, in a sense, depressive.
Yes, it was.
Well, that makes me more optimistic if I hear you speak. We have the same impression when we talk to the industry. It's a very much demand-driven development now. All sectors of the financial industry, insurance, asset managers, banks also, especially global banks, they tell us they see sustainability as they start to integrate that model into their existing business models and see that as a growing share of their future profits. So given that you have a demand kind of willingness to move towards less carbon, towards more sustainability, maybe also in a broader sense. The ESG, remember, that also will speaks well and positively about future growth. And this is something that the audience should also keep in mind, that opportunity costs must be taken into account when you're striving for the short-term profit. Think about the longer-term profit. Think about the sustainable profit.
Can I make the point here? It's interesting. You mentioned the law change in France. I don't know about any other countries, but I know about Switzerland. And thanks to the Swiss administration, there has been a transaction monitor for pensions funds, so where pension funds could input their portfolio and see on what level or on what path they are. Given that they are on a path to a 6-degree temperature increase, wouldn't it be necessary to do more than just wait for the financial firms to adapt?
Yeah.
Or the pension funds in this case?
Well, this has been a first attempt, a first round with a model that is reasonably good. There will be a second round coming. We said we do that together with the Office of the Environment. The results were not as good as hoped for, but it's also more of an educational process to actually get the transparency, get the conscience where, as a pension fund manager or an asset manager, you stand relative to the goal of 2%. And we've held intensive consultation and discussions, and in Switzerland, the regulatory, the mandatory approach does not command broad support at all. Ask anyone in the industry to say, look, what counts is to get traction on the Swiss level, on the national level. In Switzerland, if we focus on more transparency and we focus on more market-based solutions and incentives, we'll actually be able to achieve more than trying to impose a regulatory measure, another regulatory measure horizontally that would, for example, impose certain investment limits or direct investments. That is something that investors should be able, as part of their fiduciary duty, do themselves.
Can I, Guido Führer, I would really like to hear you. You mentioned it a bit at the beginning already. How do you go about decarbonizing a portfolio? It's not quite simple. I mean, as you said, you can just sell all the oil and gas in whatever way you hold them, the oil and gas sector. How do you go about at your firm? And then I would like to hear how you help clients to do that as well.
I think there are various ways, and the way how we clustered it is kind of the 3-pillar approach. And starting with the exclusion one, that's for me the last measure. If nothing else works, then you exclude, you sell, you basically dump. The other one is, we call it kind of the inclusion. This is thematic investments. You can have a green bond portfolio, or you can invest into renewable kind of infrastructure piece. That's all done, and we are engaged in all those topics, and I guess many institutional investors. The most meaningful and the most lasting, the most sustainable way is the enhancement approach, our 3rd pillar. And we described this last year when we published our learnings in the sense of shaping the future of investment in the responsible investment piece. Just a week ago, we made a publication, basically what are the next steps on our journey. And the benchmark, also, if I see now what is happening in our portfolio, the benchmark is by far the most meaningful piece. And once you change benchmark, you have most impact. And it's impact which is not only kind of clustered in a 1 or 2% allocation in green bonds. That's relatively easy as an investor, but the big thing happens via benchmark. And That's why everyone is measured relative to something, and if that relative has a new kind of starting point and completely independent of the more commercial one, you make the biggest difference. And I consider it as an opportunity, and it's for us, for our industry. Why? I strongly believe it makes sense economically. There's no excuse anymore, and you have a better risk-adjusted portfolio. Yep. And that's why nothing can hold you back from poor short-term economic thinking. Point number one. Point number two is, if you look at millennials, they look things differently than maybe what we have taught in our education. And by 2020, 23 trillion US dollar are managed indirectly or directly by millennials. With other words, they will look things differently. If you now put the whole thing from an offering point of view, there's a huge opportunity to meet that demand which comes. For me, the biggest opportunity is, again, you can work with law, and I think the European Commission is probably most advanced of all the big kind of regional discussion. They established now this technical expert group on sustainable finance, and we were appointed to be member of it, and that's why we help them to make it better accessible for institutional money. And institutional money, we shouldn't underestimate. You mentioned before pension fund, insurance, and basically sovereign wealth fund. These are very long-term investment and investment strategy. And if you count them, you end up at 75 trillion. Now, if you start redirecting 75 trillion, this has a long-lasting impact. And this could be redirected to new topics which makes economic sense. And the world GDP is about 90 trillion. That means if 75 can somehow redirect it, it helps. And I see it our job, that's why we do such publication. We are not an asset manager, we don't have any third party. As I mentioned, we do it for our own company, but what we basically add to the discussion is the learnings. That's why we are super public, what type of benchmark we're using, what is the turnover through benchmark shifts, how much risk-adjusted return impact we have. We do this because we believe it makes sense for our company, it makes sense for our industry, and clearly for society. And also with René Weber and with the government, I think this is a unique opportunity to collaborate, because many of my colleagues are hindered because there's not a lot of standardization. Again, how are climate risk published? We have the Financial Stability Board.
Can we just talk about this later? Because that's an interesting point. How do you advise clients to decarbonize their portfolio?
So as a matter of fact, as Guido mentioned, we are a bit different from Huder because we have different clients and we need to deal with different demand and sensibilities. That being said, it's clear that when we talk about the decarbonization topic with some of our clients, we would see three broad approaches. The first approach to reducing the carbon footprint of a broad portfolio would be, as a matter of fact, to implement, I would say, a more or less stringent exclusion policy based on companies' carbon emissions. Typically, a number of clients, as well as Amundi from a broad investment policy perspective, do not invest anymore in companies involved in the coal business because it's the most carbon-intensive business. So you have this type of exclusions. Another approach, which is more what we do on the index platform, is some kind of best-in-class approach. The idea here is that you try to replicate your broad market exposure, because as you know now, a very large number of asset owners have a significant portion of their portfolio invested in index strategies. So we have seen the rise of so-called low-carbon indices or decarbonized indices. And these indices or these index solutions, what they do basically is that they try to replicate the performance of a broad market index, so they are still invested across all sectors, and they try to do that while at the same time excluding in each single sector the most carbon-intensive businesses. So the idea is that you want to significantly reduce your carbon footprints with a minimum tracking error relative to your parent index. And just to give you a rough number like this, what we've seen on broad market indices is that we are able to reduce the carbon footprint by, I would say, 50% with a tracking error level of less than 0.5% relative to the market index. So for the index nerds here, that's a very good number. That's a very good number, and that's very interesting from a broad governance perspective, because you don't need to take a lot of risk, relative risk, but at the same time you can achieve very, very significant results. And then the third approach that we see when investors tell us, I want a low carbon solution, so here I'm stepping out of my index platform, are, as a matter of fact, as Guido mentioned, thematic strategies. Thematic strategies such as green technology funds or green bond funds, which are very popular among investors, because the beauty of a green bond fund or of a green bond is that you can quite immediately understand the impact in terms, for example, of carbon emission reduction of your investment. And this is something that is a bit more difficult to do when you look at investment in equity, because the impact conceptually is a bit more difficult to measure.
Thanks very much. What about disclosure? You touched on a good point there. Oh, sorry, it was you. You are representing Switzerland. Probably not you, but your department at the international level, at the Financial Stability Board. They have worked to come up with some disclosure rules. So how far are we in that process? Is it continuing after the first report?
Yeah, maybe my first comment. I didn't want to be misunderstood before. It's not that we're having a totally hands-off approach. When it comes to regulation, we just observed the first rule of regulation, which is do no harm. And so that's why we're quite a bit cautious in trying to impose from our side any new regulation. And you know as well that we just had this huge feed leg process. There's very little appetite to introduce regulation right now. So the best thing we can do in this kind of second best world in general is to work internationally. Of course, also on the national level, in dialogue with the bigger players to actually move volume into the right direction. And then on the international stage, there is, in fact, the G20 Sustainable Finance Group that is still active. It's a bit shaky. As you know, every chair of the G20 can more or less prune or open new working groups. That working group has survived since 2016, since China set it up, and we have been advocates to keep it, and we're actively working in that group with a focus on the early, say, on transparency, on understanding what you mean when you say sustainability. And that's also where this EU action plan and also proposals now in the EU kind of come together with that. We don't have anything similar in Switzerland, but the general view is that when it comes to taxonomy issues, we shouldn't do it alone. We have to either on the global or on the EU level see that there's enough. There are enough countries that would agree on a taxonomy that would then provide the market players with a large enough market to actually use that taxonomy. So right now, apart from the G20, we're also in contact with the EU, with kind of the EU Commission. Those people on a technical level that prepare and work on developing the taxonomy.
And those
it has not been advanced, it's just been started. And parallelly, we look at the EU's proposals and see whether there's anything that we can use for our domestic purposes, whether it will make sense to adopt some measures for Switzerland.
That's why I'm very happy to hear that the coordination is, in my view, key. Worst case is if each country goes its own way. And for, let's say, for most global institutional investor, that means it's a lost opportunity, because if the implementation, application, but also the product offering is massively differing, you have lost a huge opportunity. That's why I think what Mr. Weber just referred to, really look which are where we have the biggest momentum, which goes in the right direction. Then we should support it both from a public as well as from a private sector. That's why we engage also in this technical task force. And it's very clear that two specific proposals go into the capital regulation. That means it could have an impact how much capital you have to underpin depending on your riskness of the portfolio in respect of environment, both for pension fund, but also insurance companies as well as banks. That's why it's becoming very specific. And for me, having a partnership, public sector and private sector, allows us to have maybe something which is passportable to different countries, hopefully globally at one day, but at least we can start somewhere in Europe, and support and not try to deviate where it's not absolutely crucial. Otherwise, you basically dilute the unique opportunity. And the public side, as besides specific intervention, can add a lot on making sure that we have common terms. Again, the taxonomy, which you just mentioned, but also help on the reporting, on the standardization of the reporting of companies, so that it's easy accessible for, let's say, for non-experts. And then you have a huge platform created, which is, I guess, very sustainable. That's why another opportunity to partnering up. It's of interest for private sector, because this is a real risk, it's a real threat. And now basically bringing the product offering from Amundi, but also other asset managers together with a framework which is supported by the public side. And that's why there's for everyone, there's a space. And this is not the case all the time. There's no controversy. That's why if you bring the common interest together, it's an opportunity also for the financial center Switzerland. I believe in Switzerland we have a lot of assets which are managed, 7 trillion, and already 1.5 have this ESG label. I think it's a perfect topic also from a country point of view. Again, Switzerland, I think we are known to think forward and maybe have a lot of sensitivity for science, but also for kind of nature and other topics. And we know it's probably the product demand of the next generation. That's why I consider this is not the short-term kind of fashion, which will disappear, clearly not based on the underlying challenge. That's why capturing that and basically make something out of it, be it on the investment side, product offering, but also from the public side, is win-win.
We have to wrap it up, but I have one last question for Frederick. Now, speaking in return, numbers. When I give my money to my pension funds, well, I have to, and they invest in sustainable investments, that means I lose a return in the short run, maybe. Do they, or don't think about pension funds? Is it the fiduciary duty of the asset manager or my pension fund to invest in sustainable investments, or should it be to maximize the return?
So that's a very good question. But what we've seen,
3 minutes.
and here I'm just talking about what I have seen, what we've seen on the different sustainable strategies that we manage, and you have to understand that there are many different sustainable strategies, so it's difficult to say yes or no. That being said, for example, over the past 4 years, since the low carbon indices have been, let's say, live, their performance, their ex-post performance has been better than the traditional capitalization weighted indices. What I can tell you otherwise is that a number of the so-called ESG strategies that we have, the best-in-class strategies that we have at Amundi, have been performing better than their market indices over the past few years. Now, regarding the fiduciary duty of the portfolio manager, it is in the long run to maximize the risk-adjusted return of the portfolio of the clients, following the investment constraints given by the client. So if the clients has specific desire, specific constraints, specific value. In any case, they have to be taken into account by the portfolio manager when he builds the portfolio. Now, regarding the impact of sustainability on long-term risk-adjusted performance, I believe it is very clear that when you talk about climate in particular, there is a market failure at the moment because otherwise the market price of carbon would be much higher than it is at the moment. And this market failure, if it is properly addressed either by the regulators or maybe by the consumers, in the long run, it will lead to a massive repricing of carbon, and it should be detrimental to carbon-intensive businesses. So I believe that it is part of the fiduciary duty of a portfolio manager, an asset manager, to take into account this long-term risk when he builds the investor portfolio, and therefore it should be taken into account and completely integrated when the portfolio is built. So it's not, we do not believe it's adverse to portfolio performance. We believe it's one element that will help the portfolio manager to create the best possible risk-adjusted performance in the long run.
Thank you very much. This is what we have time for on the panel, but we have like 5 minutes for questions. And as I mentioned, Mr. Stocker is still here, so he can take questions as well. So are there questions? There's one hand. Yeah, there in the middle. Who's the microphone? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, he was first, apparently.
Okay, my name is Oliver Marchand. I'm the founder of Carbon Delta, a research analytics firm in climate that Mr. Hochwelt was talking about. I have a question for Professor Stocker. In our model, investors need to impose their view on the future in terms of probabilities of scenarios. And one huge discussion that almost all investors are engaging with us in is, for example, the probability of a 2-degree scenario. So I'd like to hear your view on that. Is it 10%, 50%, or 90%?
That depends on our policies. That depends on our decisions. It's basically in our hands whether that probability is 100%, it's still doable, or whether it's 0% if we don't do something, then of course that target will be missed. And what we already can see is that it has become extremely hard to be more ambitious and keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees, as we already have experienced 1 degrees, and about 0.3 degrees are still in the pipeline in this system that is not in equilibrium. It becomes more and more difficult to keep that second target, that more ambitious target in Paris. So for 2 degrees, I would say, yes, there is good hope that we can do it, but not by sitting around and doing nothing. 1.5 is really extremely ambitious.
Yeah, that was the second question there.
My name is Christopher Mbanefo. I'm representing the company Yasava Solutions in Lausanne. As an aerospace engineer, one of the challenges that we face when we create a spacecraft to go from one planet to the other is that we have to effectively simulate what the planet is doing. And one of the interesting things, and I challenge all of you, is to figure out what is the most valuable service that is being provided to us on a 24/7 basis. And the most valuable service provided is actually the balancing of greenhouse gases on the planet. And this is done 24/7, silently, without us actually giving adequate credit to the mechanisms involved. So moving forward, the basic idea is that we need to achieve an overall balance. And for that balance of greenhouse gases to be achieved, we all need to work together. And this is effectively one of the things. So looking at a challenge and changing that into an opportunity, just for the sake of argument, the CO2 emissions on an annual basis is roughly about 12 billion metric tons, as we have it now. The price per ton of CO2 currently is around 14 euros a ton. So multiply 14 by 12 billion tons, then you get an interesting figure. The projected increase in CO2 pricing is all the way up to $120 per metric ton. If you multiply that, you're looking at a market opportunity on an annual basis of over $1.5 trillion. So is there a way of changing an opportunity, or rather a challenge into an opportunity? And the answer is absolutely yes.
Can you have a question
Now,
for the
the
panel,
question
or?
is the following. Solutions will also come from the private sector. So what we are doing, as just for the sake of argument, just to add that into the basic equation, is the fourth industrial revolution, which Dr. Stocker was referring to, is actually possible now. So if we are able to connect emitters of CO2 directly with converters of CO2, is that possible? Yes. And we are creating a platform now using blockchain technology.
Okay, can you mention your name again and or the platform and please ask a question because we're running late.
The question that I have is it possible to create a overall solution that is transparent, that not only connects CO2 emitters with converters, number two, it empowers the custodians of carbon sinks, and three, increases the overall return on investment for the investor? That is the question.
Thanks. Yeah, please.
Maybe I won't go into the three questions in detail. I just want to mention that you had the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement sets out goals, also sets out goals for financing. And part of that financing is official financing, and the bigger and larger chunk is actually, well, an objective of private financing. Now, to my knowledge, none of the countries that actually part of that Paris Agreement have actually found a solution yet how to get that private financing part fully into the picture, without which the 2% will not be achieved. There are different ways you can think about it. You can resort to fintech, to blockchain solutions. You can see asset managers coming up with products or with benchmarks and trying to move that volume towards climate sustainability. But the fact is, that's a big challenge and an opportunity, as I say, but the opportunity is to be captured by the private sector. I'm not sure how much the public sector can push and support or pull or whatever, but it is there, the challenge is there, and even in Switzerland we don't have a good way yet how to fill the gap that we committed to in Paris.
But just to build on what you just said, Mr. Weber, it's very clear that you need to tackle the big pot of money. That's why the institutional money, this is sticky, this is long-term, and that's why you need to make the hurdles lower for those institutional money to flow into the area where we believe makes economic sense, but also adds to a more sustainable world. And that's why the challenge which you mentioned, to connect those two things, to make it basically fundable and to make it sustainable on long term, it's clearly, the opportunity is clearly here, and that's why all our efforts, I think also from the government as well as from the private sector, is to reduce those hurdles. And hurdles means basically introduce standardization in the market, make it much easier to invest, make clear kind of labels, what is really now sustainable, what not. These are things which are absolutely basic, and if you can overcome them as quickly as possible, you can direct many of the flows. And that's why the answer is, I think it's fundable, And we have to make sure that the money is basically accessible. And at the moment, we have a few hurdles which we jointly work on. Again, we added this to our last publication. Basically, we have 4 wishes as an institutional investor. And if we can tackle them, I'm pretty sure we will not be the only one which are completely switched. And that's why I hope we can encourage more. And if we can encourage more, we can close that gap of funding, which is absolutely necessary to achieve the Paris goal.
Perhaps a very quick note of caution. If we do not manage to reduce the emissions that we have currently occurring, we will miss the 2-degree target. In other words, there won't be enough sinks on this planet to cope with the emissions that we have today. Now, the point of my explanation was that it's not really necessary for many activities that we carry out as industrialized countries to actually burn fossil fuels. There are alternatives, and most of the ambition has to go there because there won't be enough sinks to cope with current emissions.
Thank you very much. I think we conclude here. We are a bit late, but that's fine. Can we meet at 11:35, please, after the coffee break here? Thanks very much. And thanks for the panel. Thank you.